Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski, and this is Sharper Pen Image Consulting. Generally, I do literary analysis as well as behavior and communication analysis. But today specifically, I'll be reading more from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. And specifically relevant to what I've been putting on this channel, there's Nietzsche's aphorism, The Greatest Weight, here in the Gay Science, as well as how it reflects as Zarathustra as philosopher of the eternal recurrence. So there's several references to it elsewhere in his work. There's a few places, but specifically here in Zarathustra. And it relates to one's position in the world, meaning that if you understand kind of who and what you are, you see that you already have a place in the world, and that no matter what you do, who and what you are is what's consistent. And then we have a memory, and part of what's so difficult about accepting and affirming the future is if you already know your past and you know how the past was, and then you know how the future is going to be. Well, what recourse does that give you if you basically can already kind of come to see your fate therein? More than this, it also speaks to the past because you're left with the question of, well, regardless of what is in the present or that the future may hold, the past is done. You can't undo it. You can't change it. What happened is what happened. Where you come from is where you come from, right? There's all these elements that, the moment somebody begins to resist them, it's, you're throwing yourself up against a mountain, right? What is what is, and that transpired, and there's no changing that. So a lot of what Zarathustra is up against is this sort of fatedness, are these certain inevitabilities, these seemingly eternally recurring themes, these challenges and sufferings. So he kind of gets into this here in section 24 in the Happy Isles. The figs fall from the trees, they are good and sweet, and in falling the red skins of them break. A north wind am I to ripe figs. Thus, like figs, do these doctrines fall for you, my friends. Imbibe now their juice and their sweet substance. It is autumn all around, and clear sky and afternoon. Lo, what fullness is around us! And out of the midst of superabundance, it is delightful to look out upon distant seas. Speaking metaphorically, the future, right? Future potential, future in creation. Once did people say God when they looked out upon distant seas. Now, however, I have taught you to say Superman, right? So Nietzsche's saying we're done with God. We're back to paganism. We're back to tribalism. For some people, yes, they'll be caught up in the caves and in the shadows forever. Some people will be believers forever. Some people will be stuck or at wherever they're at. But for those who are looking to something more of the future, what is it? It's not more stuff. It's not more things. It's not more of the same that got us here, right? It's something more. So Zarathustra poses a Superman. God is a conjecture, but I do not wish your conjecturing to reach beyond your creating will, right? He's saying, drop the fantasies, drop the backworlds. Could ye create a God? Then I pray you be silent about all gods, but ye could well create the Superman. Not perhaps ye yourselves, my brethren, but into fathers and forefathers of the Superman, right? He's talking about people. He's talking about a people. He's not talking about another it's not metaphysics. He's not talking about an ideal realm. He's not talking about an ideal form. He's talking about the ideal people. Could ye conceive a God? But let this mean will to truth unto you, and everything be transformed into the humanly conceivable, the humanly visible, the humanly sensible. Your own discernment shall ye follow out to the end. So you could say he's possibly saying trust your own intuition and your own instincts there. And more specifically, he means quite literally the creation and education of people, not just like it doesn't happen on a whim where the lightning strike is generated, right? It doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's no overleaping what was. That's also a big part of what Zarathustra discusses. And how could ye endure life without the hope, ye discerning ones? Neither in the inconceivable could ye have been born, nor in the irrational. But that I may reveal my heart entirely unto you, my friends. If there were gods, how could I endure to be no God? Therefore, there are no gods. So he's saying if this is what life aspires to in sentience and self-reflection and understanding, the human psychology, right, that it does in it, that it is a will to procreate, right? If it's not him, then what would it be? Therefore, there are no gods. Yeah, have I drawn the conclusion now, however doth it draw me. God is a conjecture, but who could drink all the bitterness out of this conjecture without dying? Shall his faith be taken from the creating one, and from the eagle his flights into eagle heights? So he's saying, if you remove God or you try to take away someone's belief, it's like removing the feathers that allow the eagle to fly. So people become embittered by the disillusionment, by the loss of gods, by the loss of rank and order and authority and hierarchy, and back to kind of square one here, recognizing that modern people are living in a nihilistic world, in a cynical world. They're living without closure, and a lot of them are living without hope. So God is a thought, it maketh all the straight crooked, and all that standeth real. What? Time would be gone, and all that is perishable would be but a lie. So if you remove God, time itself ceases to have meaning or matter. And then, right, because now there's no timeline to follow. Now there's no story. Now there's no beginning or end. So time would be gone, and all the perishable would be but a lie, meaning it's not eternal. There aren't these forms. And I guess you could also read it straightforward too, not like I just did. Quite literally, with God, that time would be gone, and all that is perishable becomes a lie, right? Like truth in history in the extra moral sense, wherever that essay is titled. So to think is giddiness and vertigo to all human limbs, and even vomiting to the stomach. Verily, the reeling sickness do I call it, to conjecture such a thing, right? Because this goes beyond just like one's own ego and one's own desires. It's it's almost, I guess, philosophically and religiously, it's the equivalent of conspiratorially, that idea of the flat earth, in the sense that if you change the basic model, you basically need a whole new description and understanding and mapping of the cosmos, because you've just changed the fundamental laws and basis of everything. So that's what he means when he says it is a reeling sickness to give up old conjectures and ideas, because even if we remove God, there could be other assumptions, illusions, projections that one is mistaken on, that to have to then go back and reevaluate and re-examine what that is and how it might be wrong in one's own head, right, is the same reeling sickness. Evil do I call it, misanthropic, all the teaching about the one and the plenum and the unmoved and the sufficient and the imperishable. So he's talking about all this old conjecture, all this old musty stuff, all this stuff that's been posed in the past and been, written about endlessly, and that will be into the future, that, ultimately it winds up being a waste of time. It's nihilistic, because not only did it carry the seeds of its own destruction, but more specifically is that it leads nowhere. There's nothing left there. That's how you could say it. Those fields are empty. There's nothing left to harvest there, um, in some sense. So all the imperishable, that's but a simile, and the poets lie too much. But of time and becoming shall the best similes speak. A praise shall they be, right? So if the goal and aim is a superior man, then this is what he's saying, that time and becoming shall be the best simile speak, a praise shall they be, and a justification of all perishableness. Creating, that is the great salvation from suffering and life's alleviation. But for the Creator to appear, suffering itself is needed, and much transformation. Yeah, much bitter dying must there be in your life, ye creators. Thus are ye advocates and justifiers of all perishableness. Meaning, the more tragedy and suffering you can endure and then still get up to not become embittered to life, and to be able to rise again to the occasion and to the challenge day after day, year after year, regardless of what happens, right? There is something heroic to that. There is something about, uh, you know, from there's differences between getting knocked down and getting up, and then what can also be tantamount to raising oneself from the dead. So it can go far beyond just something like ego death, which makes it sound minor. the concept of ego death, I don't like it because it's too generalized, too common, too much, and it doesn't account for what the individual actually goes through. Because to say like, oh, there's a part of the ego that can die off implies it's necessary, or that's unnecessary. But again, let's say it's not that it's unnecessary, it could just be a mistake. So if someone believes in something that they realize is wrong, that they later realize, right, and now they've built cornerstones of their life around these beliefs and these, and they have relationships and networks around that, right? This is what he's talking about. It gets very serious. It's not just ego death, it's rearranging one's whole life based on a better understanding of oneself and how the world and people really are. So it gets really serious, which is why he says this. Um, Creating, that is the great salvation from suffering, life's alleviation. Much suffering is needed, much bitter dying must there be. Thus are ye advocates of and justifiers of all perishableness. For the Creator himself to be the newborn child, he must also be willing to be the child bearer and endure the pangs of the child bearer. So the death of something old is giving way for something new. Verily, through 100 souls went I my way, and through 100 cradles and birth throes. So this is where it gets personal, right? Because there's whole concepts of being in that. There's whole orientations toward the world, and maybe what one wants to give or impart, but may or may not be in a position to do so, or maybe the world and its people aren't ready. I think I literally just read that in Foucault and Deleuze in the last video. But it gets very personal and serious here. So he says, much bitter dying have I known, through many souls and through hundreds of cradles and birth throes. Many a farewell have I taken. I know the heartbreaking last hours. Ah, yes. But so willeth my creating will, my fate, or to tell you it is more candidly, just such a fate willeth my will. And feeling suffereth in me, and is in prison. But my willing ever cometh to me as mine emancipator and comforter. Willing emancipateth. This is the true doctrine in will and emancipation. So teaches you Zarathustra, right? It's not someone else. It's not something else. It's definitely not the government, the state, or the institution. And it's definitely not other people, because how could they know or free you better than them, though they can help you along the way, right? So no longer willing and no longer valuing and no longer creating. That great debility may ever be far away from me. So he's talking about passive nihilism. He's talking about giving up. He's talking about hopelessness. He's talking about getting knocked down and not getting up again or ever again. And also in the discerning do I feel only my will's procreating and evolving delight. And if there be innocence in my knowledge, it is because there is a will to procreation in it. Away from God and gods did this will allure me. What would there be to create if there were gods? Right. Focus on the people, right? What's nihilistic about Christianity and what came in the past is there was so much focus on the future and eternity at the expense of the here and now, at the expense of the people here and now. And all these years later, we've come full circle, and it's no different today than it was then. So, but to man doth it ever impel me anew, his creating will, right? My fervent creative will, thus impelleth it the hammer to the stone. Ah, ye men, within the stone slumbereth an image for me, the image of my visions. Ah, that it should slumber in the hardest, ugliest stone. He's calling men ugly and saying, but within that is a better and more perfect being, is a superordinate being. Now rageth my hammer ruthlessly against its prison. From the stone fly the fragment. What's that to me? I will complete it. For a shadow came unto me. The stillest and lightest of all things once came unto me. The beauty of the Superman came unto me as a shadow. Ah, my brethren, of what account now are the gods to me? Thus spake Zarathustra, right? So he's saying he's over the past. He's saying for those like him, we're over the past, right? There's all these things that people still get caught up questioning in metaphysics. It actually reminds me, and so much of it remains in the old Buddhist parable in terms of, when I guess technically it was Hindu and Jainist as well, but it was appropriated into Buddhism, like many myths and common knowledge and mythology is appropriated. But the story of the poisoned arrow, meaning you're hit by a poisoned arrow, And then, the doctor comes to you and says, well, we got to fix, there's only so much we can do about this. And then your question is, well, who shot the arrow? And it goes, well, it doesn't matter now. You're in the medical tent and you're going to die. Okay, but what clan were they from? Okay, but what did the barbs look like? Okay, what did the feathers look like? Right before you know it, you're off in the weeds. And it shares in common with what Deleuze was talking about in another video that I posted on the channel on cinema. It's Dostoevsky's Idiot, or even James Joyce Ulysses, right? These characters, like they're connected and networked in a life and death struggle for existence. And then the moment they head out the door, they're distracted by any stupid little thing. They're arguing with idiots. They're losing their life in the streets. They're chasing shadows. They're shadow boxing. They're hunting for what they think is going to make them happy, all along missing out what they inevitably come to find out or see as more needful. So they go in these circles, right? And it takes a long time back to the Odyssey itself to find your way back home. But Nietzsche's home is a vision of the future, and it's not conjecture, and it's not idealism, and it's not an ideology. It's a people. It's a superior people. And I know it gets absurd in here because people want to get into eugenics, but basically we're talking about the raw intellectual and spiritual, therefore vital and bodily health and strength of a human being. And Nietzsche makes no bones about it that it's rare that anyone comes out well, and how many great men through history, they were the way they were because of weird brain conditions, right? They were like epileptics. And since I've been kind of looking at Zarathustra and seeing where various aphorisms kind of line up in the gay science, in this idea with now rageth my hammer ruthlessly against its prison, from the stone fly the fragments. What's that to me, right? Because he's educating in style and history and philosophy, as any man of his culture does, as any man of style and taste does. And he says, I will complete it, for a shadow came unto me, the stillest and lightest of all things came unto me, right? And when he says he crafts, he crafted many a soul, for those who've experienced ego death and more than once. And but with that, I mean also what are the crafting of one's hopes and dreams and desires for the future, and where these souls and visions of the future crash upon the rocks, and then you have to kind of reestablish and re-navigate your way back into the world and develop new and more in-depth understanding for what you missed or didn't account for. But this is aphorism 290 in the gay science, and it's called One Thing is Needful: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of the nature and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art and reason, and even weaknesses delight the eye. Here a large mass of second nature has been added. Here and there a piece of original nature has been removed, both times through long practice and daily work at it. Here the ugly that could not be removed is concealed. There it has been reinterpreted and made sublime. Much that is vague and resisted shaping has been saved and exploited for distant views. Like in what he says is one's own treasure pit is discovered last. And I think that's where he also says man is most difficult to discover and unto himself most of all. It is meant to beckon toward the far and immeasurable. In the end, when the work is finished, it becomes evident how the constraint of a single taste governed and formed everything large and small. Whether this taste was good or bad is less important than one might suppose, if only it were a single taste. It will be the strong and domineering natures that enjoy their fine gaiety in such constraint and perfection under a law of their own. The passion of their tremendous will relents in the face of all stylized nature, of all conquered and serving nature. Even when they have to build palaces and design gardens, they demur at giving nature freedom. Conversely, it is the weak characters without power over themselves that hate the constraint of style. They feel that it is bitter and evil constraint were imposed upon them, they would be demeaned. They become slaves as soon as they serve. They hate to serve. Such spirits, as they may be of the first rank, are always out to shape and interpret their environment as free nature, wild, arbitrary, fantastic, disorderly, and surprising. And they are well advised because it is only in this way that they can give pleasure to themselves. For one thing is needful, that a human being should attain satisfaction with himself, whether it be by means of this or that poetry and art. Only then is a human being at all tolerable to behold. So he's basically saying if they're not at least a little bit happy with themselves, oof, they make for miserable company. So whoever is so whoever is dissatisfied with himself is continually ready for revenge, and we others will be his victims, if only by having to endure his ugly sight. For the fight of what is for the sight of what is ugly makes one bad and gloomy. Yes. So imagine a world full of people caught up in arguing and tending to and dealing with the ugly and gloomy, right? And if you can kind of see and understand that, you can understand that most people don't have enough art and style in their life, either given to them by others or shared with by others or from their own creation. So Nietzsche is saying that, this to create and to craft oneself, to draw others to yourself, to then procreate in all the ways in which human beings do, right? Um, whether that's art, whether that's in the world, whether that's with another human being, right? That the whole thing is a shaping, it is an education, it is a taming, it is a mediation, it's a multiplicity of forces at work. And everyone within that structure and within these larger structures does serve whether they like it or not. And it's a question of what is their attitude? What is their style? Nietzsche saw that it is in the ugliest stone, and his political characterization was the left doesn't want to work and the right doesn't want to think. And generally, the species is pretty primitive and atavistic, and it'll be troublesome for a long time to come. But that was that in the happy isles, right? And it is a lesson and a chapter on self overcoming, right? Because I said ego death is too generalized and it doesn't carry or transfer or relate the personal losses, whether, because even if it's theoretical, one can wrap up, in the case of religion and other things, for instance, right? Again, one can wrap up one's whole being in such things. So there's no telling to what one is losing in any conceivable futures. And then there's this, what I'm going to get into with the greatest weight and eternal recurrence is that idea again. You can't change the past. You can't go back and redo it. It even kind of gets into the concepts of like the 7 stages of grief, which even by its naming almost makes it sound like it's something separate or secondary to human nature versus like depending on what you lose, when and how you lose it, that could affect you daily for the rest of your life. And there's no telling how one may or may not be able to come to terms with that, how that modern people live with no closure in a sense anyway. And then if you have to deal with trauma, problems, bad relations, bad life, a bad position in the world, all these sorts of things, of course, it leads to horrific embitterment, the flights of fantasy and escape, all sorts of crazy thinking, all sorts of insanities and problems, right? So it's no small thing. Anyway, again, I'm Zach Markowski. This has been Thus Spake Zarathustra in the Happy Isles. Remember, away from and away with the non-creating gloomy will, and it is the creating will that emancipates, and it's one's own will, right? Because no one else can do that for you. Again, thanks for checking out the channel, and if we're both fortunate enough to be here tomorrow or the next day, I'll see you then, hopefully. Take care.